Well, good morning. Welcome to Grover Hill Zion United Methodist Church. We're glad you're viewing and watching some of this video. Of course, you're always welcome to join us at the main campus at 204 South Harrison Street in Grover Hill, Ohio. This morning I'm going to be speaking from Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. And it's a story of the potter, which is a parable that God gives to Jeremiah the prophet to admonish God's people as to how God will punish them if they don't turn from their wicked ways. Jeremiah the prophet lived in a day when the people as a nation had turned their backs on God, even after everything God did for them. He brought them from slavery and bondage in Egypt and brought them through the desert wilderness, provided all their needs and led them to the promised land, the wonderful promised land. And the Lord said to Jeremiah, he said, "Listen, I knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart to be a prophet to the nations, to tell them of their great sin against me and how I'm going to punish them for their sin." Jeremiah begins warning the people that they have ignited the fire of God's wrath and his anger. And the people hated Jeremiah for it. They turned against him and they devised schemes to discredit his words and to harm him so that he would stop preaching about the Lord. They didn't want to hear any of that. Not much different than what our world seems to be today. Throughout Europe and even here in our own land, people have fallen away from God and they have forgotten about all the blessings that we have in this land. And they're wanting to revert back to places where people who founded this nation came from. God said to tell the people this: I brought them through the deserts, and I gave them a fertile land. Israel in their youth loved me as a bride. They were holy, and I provided them food and water. Now they have turned away. I gave them a wonderful land, and they have defiled it with corruption by committing terrible, unthinkable, unspeakable sins. Sins that I've never imagined that they would do. They have committed two sins against me, the Lord said. First, they have forsaken me, the spring of living water. And second, they have dug their own cisterns that are broken and cannot hold water. They've tried to make their own way. Listen, we do that, don't we? We try to make our own way. And we can't make our own way in this world by ourselves. Well, we can kid ourselves and say we are. We might get by in this world, but that's not going to do us any good in the next. We'll never get there without God. We'll never make it to the next world. Oh, we'll make it a place we don't want to go, okay. My people have forgotten me, the Lord said. Their priests follow worthless idols, and they even burn incense to them of all things. Can you imagine that? They sacrifice to these worthless idols that they created with their own hands. They're not really gods at all, but they worship them anyway. They worship the work of their hands. Think about that. We do that today, don't we? Somebody will go out and make something with their hands and they'll sit back there and admire it and can't let it go. We fail to realize that everything in this world is temporary except God, except the divine. Everything else will turn to rust or to dust, even the work of our hands. The people traded their glory for worthless idols. They didn't even ask, "Where is the Lord?" And the Lord said they don't have any awe of me, no respect of me or fear. They don't honor me. They simply say to the wood, you are my father. Or they say to the stone, you gave me birth. And yet when they're in trouble, they say, come and save me. Well, let them go to the gods that they created and made for themselves and ask them to save them. In Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 5, the people even built high fires and sacrificed their sons in the flames to whom they called a god Baal, which is, again, just an idol. They killed their own children as a sacrifice to a worthless idol. How in the world can a parent do that? Who would ever dream that a parent would do such a thing? God didn't even imagine that. And the Lord said, the day is coming when I will punish my people. I'll punish them severely unless they repent. God had plans to punish Israel for the evil that it had done. And yet he was willing to change his mind if only the people would repent and turn their hearts towards him. If only they would just go back to their roots. But they would not. God knew they wouldn't. He knew they wouldn't repent at all. They just continued to do what they've been doing. They were just liking it too much. Too much fun. Defiling the land and refusing to keep the Sabbath holy. Today, it's not much different as if we look at our world for the last 100 days or so, and we see all kinds of rioting and violence and looting, and we see people who don't agree with you. They don't like a piece of clothing you're wearing, for crying out loud. They don't like a Christian symbol that you might be wearing. They don't like some of the words you might say. They're fascists, so they'll try to hurt you. They'll try to burn your business down and destroy you, put you out of business. They'll try to harm your family. You know, in the early 19th century, we had dictators that did that very same thing, burned books and burned Bibles and tried to control people's thoughts, and it led us into 2 world wars. And now history seems to be repeating itself. Today, people are rejecting all that is sacred, destroying churches, just like the Taliban has done in the Mideast. And mocking God, and God's people just simply seem to acquiesce and let them go, even though those people are a very small minority. When you look at our country and you look at what's happening in the world today, it doesn't sound like it's very much different from the people long ago, does it? The Lord said to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitterness for sweet and sweet for bitter. 2 Chronicles 7:14. Samuel writes, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sin and heal their land. And that's exactly what the Lord is saying through Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah's prophecy about God punishing his people came true in 587 BC. People were defeated and carried away to captivity in Babylon. In chapter 18, the Lord showed Jeremiah a parable to explain what he was going to do to his people, Israel. It's a story of the potter. In Jeremiah 18, the Lord told Jeremiah, go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. And so Jeremiah went down to the potter's house and he saw the potter working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay marred in his hands. And so the potter just simply destroyed that shape that he was forming into another pot. He made it into something that seemed best to him. And Jeremiah said, when the word of the Lord came to me, house of Israel, can I not do to you as the potter does to the clay? Like the clay in the hand of the potter, so you are in my hands, the Lord said. If at any time I announce that a nation or a kingdom is to be uprooted or torn down or destroyed for its wickedness, if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it what I had planned. And yet, if at another time I announce that the nation or the kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight, then I will reconsider the good that I had intended for it. That's the parable that Jeremiah carried to the people. And in this parable, God as the potter, in this parable, made the vessel into what he wanted it to be. In the Creator's mind, before we are created, he had an idea of what he wants us to be. Who we are and even where we are is all in the providence of God. We should not despise our lives of who we are or even where we are when something happens to us. We should be sure that we stay in God's hands, in the potter's hands. He has formed us and told, just as he told to Jeremiah and Isaiah the prophet, that God knew us. He knew us before we were even formed in our mother's womb. You know, every believer is in the hands of God and being shaped according to his perfect will. And as the potter packs the clay for his purpose, so the Lord is shaping us into what he wants us to be. As we think about the clay in this parable, the clay is in the perfect position to be formed into something useful to God. Notice that the clay on the wheel, which could intimate the world, we as the clay are influenced by life's experiences and by life's circumstances. The clay in his hands, as long as we are the clay in his hands, and as long as we are in his hands, we will be molded and shaped by the purpose and power of God. He is molding us into the image of Christ, just so long as we don't resist it, as the people did long ago, and some are doing today as well. We'll be formed in his image and likeness. And as the vessel being formed by the potter, the focus of Jeremiah's view is when the clay became marred in his hands. It's so true that this is something that happens to us even while in his hands. Life causes us to question his purpose and design for us. We resist his workings, and the vessel we become is not what God intended us to be. You ever been to a potter's house? You know, in the potter's shop, there's perhaps a shelf there, or certainly out back, there are vessels or useless piles of clay that were thrown out because they couldn't be formed. Something was wrong with them. But have you noticed that the potter, when we become marred in God's hands, he takes and reforms us, and he shapes us into a new vessel. Israel would not become what God had planned for them. They became a vessel of unrighteousness. However, God is taking and shaping us into the image and likeness of Christ, who is making us into a new creation. So remember that if you go through the fires of hell in this life, if you go through hard, difficult times, that God will use those tough times to mold you and to make you into what He would have you be. God's hands are making you into something worth far more than the finest china, something more than money can buy. God is making you into that which is priceless.